All right, so what I want to start by showing you is a faux flat felled seam that I've already sewn onto one of the legs of my jeans. And this is the way that I taught it in the first class, basically. And you can see, I don't know if you can see with this dark denim, but the row of stitching that is used to stitch the yoke to the leg initially shows up at the top of the flat fell or the folded area. And so what I realized is if you actually baste that in, then you can take that stitching out when you're done, and then you don't see that stitching, so you can get a nice clean flat felled seam in the back that looks really professional, and you don't have that little extra stitching that you use to sew the back yoke on to begin with. So I just want to peek under here and show you what I did. I basically trimmed the legs seam allowance, and then I folded the yoke seam allowance under 1/4 inch, and then I used a piece of Sokisi knit stay tape to hold that all nice and stay put for me. And I found that this really works on stretched denim because it's also stabilizing the denim when you go to top stitch. So that's how far I've gotten on this one. So I'm going to start from scratch, and I'm going to show you how to do this from the start. So I'm going to put this leg away, and I'm going to bring in this leg. Now I'm going to turn it wrong side up because it's easier to see what we're doing. So when you go to sew this flat felled seam, you want to put your wrong sides together for the first step. So we're going to actually, I have it pinned, so the lower side or the longer side gets sewn to the top of the back leg, and I'm going to be using a 3/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so I'm going to sew this, but remember I want to baste this because I want to take this seam out. So I'm going to go to my settings, and I'm going to adjust my stitch length to be really long. So on this machine I can make it 6 millimeters long, and I'm going to sew my 3/4 inch seam allowance. And you don't want to back tack either, because if you want to take it out you want it really easy. So I know I'm just going to go really slow, because when you're working with a basting stitch it jumps really, you know, for each stitch it's a long distance that it's actually sewing. So I'm going to go really slow, and I'm just going to do my 3/4 inch seam. Those of you who know me know that I sew like, you know, like the road runner. So for me to go slow, that tells you it's an important step. Okay, so now I've got my yoke sewed onto the back leg, and you can see the seam allowance is facing to the right side. The first thing I'm going to do is press both of these seam allowances down. I'm going to have my iron handy here. Alright, let me switch it to the side. It's important to press those down in a way where there's no extra fold in the fabric, because it'll affect your fit. So from the back you want to make sure that, you know, it's folded down properly. And give that some nice steam. Okay. Alright, so now from the right side we want to trim this lower edge of the seam allowance to like 1/4 inch. So if I hold this right here and just slide across, and it gives me a pretty good edge. Because the height of the blade underneath kind of keeps me at a pretty even distance. I mean, it's a little jaggy, but that's going to be perfect. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to actually press the outer edge of this top, or the yoke seam allowance, under a 1/4 inch. And see, this is where the faux part comes in, because in a real flat felled seam, the seam allowance wraps around that cut edge, or the shorter edge. But really, all I'm concerned about doing here is getting the back yoke seam allowance to be an even 1/4 inch turned under. And as I'm doing that, I'm also pressing the shorter cut edge up. So with this finger, I'm pushing this up, and I'm doing this down. So kind of in one step, I'm sort of getting them to meet. My iron's making noises like it's got a hungry tummy. Gurgly noises. Alright. Okay, so I'm going to give it some good steam, and then I'm going to use my Point Perfect tool to trap the heat. I use this so much now that I've actually lost my real clapper. I don't know where it is at the moment. Alright, so see how nice that looks? It's nice and pressed under a 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to get my Sokisi knit stay tape. I love this stuff because it's so lightweight. I'm going to cut a piece that's the equal length to the seam, and then I'm going to press that on, and that's actually going to hold the cut edges together, and it makes it easier to then top stitch nicely without worrying about it. Plus it stabilizes my stretch fabric. So this technique is a little bit different than the original pattern review class. Okay, so I'm just going to press this on. Okay. I'm going to use this to Alright, so now that this is nice and pressed, I let it cool too. Let it cool so it's nice and crisp. Now we're going to flip this over, and I'm going to press it down into its final position. And again, I'm going to use my Point Perfect to trap the heat for a second. Okay, so here is my ready to go top stitch flat felled seam, or faux flat felled seam, and you can see it's a nice even 1/2 inch wide, okay, and it's ready to go. So we're going to go back to the sewing machine now, and we're going to top stitch. Alright, so the first thing I need to do is I need to put in my top stitch thread, and I'm using this Coats & Clark top stitch thread, and I have to say I have such an easier time with it in my machine than the YLI I was using before. Okay. Alright, so I'm just gonna thread my needle. I have a size 16 top stitch needle in my machine, and I'm gonna make my stitch length 4. So it was on 6 for basting. Now I'm gonna bring it down to 4 for top stitching. Alright, so the first place I'm gonna stitch is along the folded edge that's currently still loose, and I want to stitch pretty close to the edge. Alright, let's take a look at that. See how lovely that is? I'm going to use my stiletto to go in and take out that stitching. I think it'll be easier to take it out than before I have stitching right next to it. So I'm just going to go and just pick it every couple of inches. It's hard to pull out bobbin thread when you sew through something stiff like a denim, so that's why I'm just picking it out in a few places. Okay. Alright, so I've gotten rid of my original seam that I sewed the yoke to the back leg, and I'm now going to do my second row of top stitching. Okay. Alright, so let's take a closer look at that. Alright, so you can see that that looks really nice. And I have a nice stretchy seam. I used a knit stay tape. So, you know, I'm really happy with the way that that looks. I'll give it a little steam and it'll shape up and get rid of that little bit of, you know, it's a little bit stretched, but once I steam it, it'll lay perfectly flat.